All right, welcome everyone to the November 2019 meeting of the Mississippi PowerShell User Group. Tonight we have Jeff Hicks, and he'll be presenting building a REST-based PowerShell module. Take it away, Jeff.
All right, thanks everyone. Thank you for coming, spending a little time this evening. Where I am, it is pitch black and snowing, but at least it's warm and it's got PowerShell, so it's all good. So tonight I wanted to talk about, I guess it's just a project that I've been working on, and it may be something that you may be thinking about and wondering, well, how would I do that? So the title of the presentation is Building a REST-Based PowerShell Module. And a big chunk of this is just, I wanted you to see kind of how I work, and part of what I'm working on is a module that relies on REST APIs. And as you'll see, you need to do some PowerShell stuff in order to really make this easy for you to work with and for other people to work with if you're building a tool set for something else. So let's get into this. I will eventually share a link with the group so you'll have access to the slides. There are only a few slides really, and all of my demo material so you can see everything that I'm working on. So let's see what I have here. If I can get the slides working. All right, so why are we doing all of this? Well, you may have some internet source where you have some data that you can consume via a REST API. And we'll talk a little bit about this in a moment. Or maybe you have some third-party tool in your enterprise, and there are no good PowerShell tools. Maybe they give you some poor command line tools, but maybe that third-party tool has a REST API and exposes a lot of data that way. You could build some PowerShell tooling around those APIs and build your own set of PowerShell commandlets. In other words, you want to manage something that maybe has no PowerShell commandlets, but if you have access to data or some REST API, you can consume and manage that API with PowerShell. That's kind of what I've been doing in my module, as you'll see. And you can use the same concepts for other projects that you might need to consume with different types of REST APIs. So the process, think of this more as a workflow, if you will. The very first thing you need to do is discover the documentation. You need to be able to find an authoritative source, hopefully, if you're doing the same on an internet website, that they have a clear documentation about this is the API, these are the calls, these are the methods, these are parameters, these are the things you have to do. Hopefully it'll have good examples. And then you can take those examples and turn them into PowerShell. I'll kind of walk you through how I did that with the project I'm working on. But it's very important that you be able to discover the documentation and understand what it is that you are reading. You're then going to need to convert those APIs, which if you think about it, the API is really kind of a function already. It's a little command, in essence, that you're going to run over the internet or over some web-based connection, and it's going to do something or get something, very much like a PowerShell function does. So all we're going to do is convert those APIs into PowerShell functions. And then when you're all done, obviously, you want to package all your functions up into a PowerShell module. So it's kind of a high-level process of what we'll be going through. So at least that's the process I'm working with. Now, there are a few things you need to keep in mind before we dive into this. You have to rely on the documentation. If there's a limitation to the documentation, you're going to struggle in trying to get this to work. Be aware that in some instances, some services, especially things that you may consume from an internet source, like GitHub, for example, they may have throttle limits on the number of API calls that you can make in a given time frame. This can be problematic when it comes to testing, or as you're developing, go, oh, I'm working and I'm running my command repeatedly, and you'll go, oh, I have to wait now an hour because I've exceeded my API, the number of calls that I can make in a given time frame. So you need to think about that. And hopefully that is well documented so you'll know what those things are so you can take that into account. The other thing you'll have to think about, and I'll talk about this when I get into my project, is some of these REST APIs that you need to consume may require you to have some sort of token or API key. Well, how are you going to securely manage that? Because that is a secret, really, that you want to protect. And I'm hoping in my demos, I don't think I'm going to expose my API key. And you know what, even if I do, this is for the Bitly service. If for some reason that key leaks, it's probably no big deal. I can generate a new one, and no harm, no foul. But all of these things make testing to be a little bit of a challenge because many times the REST API, you're doing something on the internet, and yeah, there's some pester stuff that you can do, but eventually you're going to just have to do it and see that it works. So there are some things you need to keep in mind. The API and the throttle key, the API keys and the throttle limit are probably the two biggest things that will trip you up as you're building your project. So, before we get into my stuff, I want to let you know that everything I'm talking about really is for IT pros who want to create more of a custom solution based on a REST API. I'm not going to be talking about any of the developer solutions like Swagger or AutoRest, or there's a tool called SoapUI that will allow you to programmatically look at a REST API and automatically create commands and stuff, and I'm not going to be consuming it in that way, right? So I'm going to be doing more of a kind of an old school approach of looking at the API, how can I convert that into a PowerShell command, and then package all that into a module. But if you're looking for more automated functions, yeah, there are things you can look at. The AutoRest is that's the new sexy thing. Swagger, there used to be a PS Swagger module, which has been, I believe, deprecated. AutoRest is now the new thing. Azure uses that a lot because all the Azure stuff is exposed to a set of APIs, and so Microsoft can throw AutoRest against all those APIs and generate all the hundreds of commandlets that we have in the Azure module. I'm not doing any of that. I'm going to do it kind of simple, one step at a time. So let's get into what I'm looking at with my project. All right, so hopefully you can all see my ISE screen, which is great for demonstration purposes. I tend to write in VS Code, but for demos, ISE is a much better tool in my opinion. So before we get into my actual project, let me just demonstrate a few concepts here. So let's look at this file here.
We're still seeing the slide.
You're still seeing the slides. All right, let me. All right.
I see your ISE.
You see the IC.
Yeah.
Let me.
Yeah, I saw your ISE also. It's just on top of the slide.
Yeah, I'm going to stop the presenting, and so now hopefully you should all see the IC. Are we good?
I just see the guest window there with your name on it.
Yeah, it looks like you may have to reshare.
All right, let me reshare. Share screen. All right, so it says that it's connecting. Let me know when you see the.
Okay. It says it's loading, which is at least promising.
Yeah.
I got it. Thank you.
There we go.
Okay. All right, so in the IC here, let's look at my. Okay, so here's another thing. Let's see if this works here. I'm going to try to start. Okay, so hopefully this came up in the window, and you should see my browser with the documentation for the who is REST API from Aaron.net. Hopefully everyone sees that. So here's an example of the documentation that I'm talking about. So Aaron, which controls all the internet numbers and whatnot, has a whole RESTful service. And there are commands here that you can look at to describe how the service works, what kind of output you can expect, what kind of things you have to do to submit data to it, and all of that. So you'll want to look through that documentation. So I've got that there as a link, but let me show you what I've done here. So let's just start with a basic test. So in looking at the API documentation, you mostly will discover that you're going to need to find some sort of like base or core URL or URI. And for the Aaron.net API, it's basically a string, and the last portion here will be your IP address. So I'm just going to save that as a variable. And then because we're doing stuff with REST, the best approach to use is Invoke REST method. Now, Invoke REST method in this particular case is going to return an XML document. Sometimes, and this is where you have to read the documentation, sometimes the results will come back as JSON. Sometimes you can specify whether you want JSON or XML. And I'll show you something in my demos that you can sometimes specify that. But for right now, I know that this is going to come back as XML. So I'm just going to save these results as an XML document. I don't really need to disable, I don't really need to keep the connection alive. I just want to take this, invoke that with Invoke REST method, and now $R is an XML document. And I can walk through this XML document and look at the properties. Now you can see the values. I can look at, for example, the organization. This is the Asia Pacific Network Information Center. You can continue drilling down to see, for example, a web page or the who is value for that. If you want to change the value of the type of data, again, you may need to look at the documentation, but one common technique is to create a header, and in the header you'll have some key. In this case, for this service, the key is accept, and then they want you to put in application/JSON. Usually it would be application JSON or application XML. So I'm going to create that header, and then I can rerun my command and specify that header. So now $J is a JSON object. And not always the prettiest thing to work with, but I can kind of walk through it. I can look at the name, property. Where it gets tricky is, notice that property name is a $, which you have to escape by putting it in quotes in order to get the value. So I can do it. It's not very pretty, and it takes a lot of work. So once I have the basic understanding, okay, I have the URI, I know Invoke REST method works, I can get the data back, I get an object back. Now I need to start turning this into a command. So conceptually, you're going to build something like a function. So here is a function that just basically takes an IP address, and I'm going to do the invoke REST method. I don't really need any fancy parsing because I'm just going to take the document that it gives me. In this case, it's going to be XML. And then I just create a custom hash table and a custom object. This is an older function. I should just make this a custom object and just be done with it. But you can see that I'm populating the properties by pulling in the values from the different values that I get from running invoke REST method. So if I were to, if you want to see how this works here, so now I have a function, so I can just load that function and do get who is IP, give it the IP address, so use my verbose output, and then now I have an object that I created on the fly, and I create that custom object properties with the data that I retrieved from the REST method. And I've written my function so that it can take multiple values and pipe it into the pipeline, so I can get multiple entries. Again, just invoking the REST method. Now, I think there are some limits here, but I'm not likely to try to resolve, 1,000 IP addresses all at once. If I do a couple at a time, it's probably no big deal. The other nice thing about this service is it doesn't require any sort of API key. It's completely open to the public. So it's a nice thing to test with. And I have a more complete version of this in my PS Script Tools module. I've also included the copy of the function here. So here you can see this is the better, newer version where I'm creating a custom object. Again, just retrieving the data from Invoke REST method, invoking the API, and building the base URL from the address and some other bells and whistles here in this function. So that's kind of the high-level approach that I'm taking, and you'll probably want to take when you're building a REST-based tool. So with that, let's go and look at my actual project that I'm working with. And again, all of this that I'm working with is based on using the Bitly API. Because I do a lot with Bitly, I share links, on social media and whatnot. And so they have a complete API here that you can work with, for example, to create a bitlink. And so let's take a moment here and look at this. So I know if I want to create a bitlink, and looking at this here, I'm going to need to, use the post method. I'll show you how we can do that here in a moment. Now, in this case, this is really nice documentation. If I can expand this actually shows me what the URI needs to be. Let's come here and let's look at the retrieve a bitlink, because get things are always much easier. So this requires me to specify the bitlink made. And again, I can look here, and so this is going to want an API reference to this URL, and then in here where it says bitlink, I'm just going to put in my value. And what's nice, again, in this documentation, all of this here that you see, this is going to be the expected output that I get. So it helps me decide or figure out how do I want to work with the results I get. Of course, I'm going to get the result anyway and then see it for myself, but it's nice having the documentation there. So what you're going to need to do is look through and figure out, okay, what are the things that I want to do? And then figure what the links are, and then start building some PowerShell around that. So this is where I started from. So there's the documentation. So let's go back here, and let's look at what I'm working with. Now, let's just do before I get into any of the command, let's just, again, do kind of a high-level proof of concept sort of approach. Now, you need for Bitly anyway, for this particular REST API, you have to have an authentication key, an OAuth key or token or an API key. You can get that in Bitly by going under your settings and requesting an API key or a link. I have mine already saved as a variable, $bitly, which hopefully is in this session. So in this case, again, I saw this in the documentation. In order to authenticate, I need to pass a header with authorization equals, and then a string, bearer, and then your API key. So $headers now will have that value. I'm not going to show that to you because if I do, then that would expose the value of my API key, and let's try to keep some things, secret between us. So let's say that I want to I want to get a link. So this is the link I want to get. This is from the PowerShell Month of Lunches 3 book. Bitly links, by the way, are case sensitive. So I know from looking at the link, if I want to get a Bitly link, I need to specify this base URL, and then the last part is the actual link, which is this thing here. So now, just to make sure we're all on the same page, right? So that is the link that I'm going to pass. And now I can do invoke REST method and pass that. And it did not like that. I'm not quite sure why I got that error because no, that did not work. Let's remove. And let's look at my. Oh, you know what? That's because $R was saved over from my previous example, which was sent to be an XML document. Now that I've removed that variable, let's see if that'll work now. There we go. So there's the link that comes back. And this is a much nicer link in this particular case. So it's a little easier to work with. I can see when it was created. I can see the ID. I can see the long URL. There's a title that I have added. I don't have any tags or anything, but I now have a reference that I pulled from the website. And I could get the same information by going to the website in my browser, but it's much nicer using PowerShell. So with that in mind, let's look at another, again, proof of concept example. And let's say I want to find the number of clicks on this. Again, I went to the documentation to find the URI to use for that, to construct that. Invoke REST method. So now $S has that type of object. Now, don't rely on the default view because sometimes, in this case, there are actually multiple entries here, but in the IC anyway, I don't necessarily see the other properties. So there's units and the unit date defaults to all days. But now that I know that, I can say, show me the unit reference. That's the time. I can treat that as a date time object. I can find the number of clicks. Again, you can see all the days there. Let's look at the first one. So on that particular day, there was 1 click. And then you can just take that data and run it through PowerShell. So I can say, hey, get all those clicks and just turn the date into a date time object and then show me the clicks. Or let's get all the clicks, turn them into a date time value, and find out how many clicks have been done. So, there's been 641 clicks on that bitlylink, and 117 was the most on a single day. Now, the other thing that you'll find with REST APIs is that sometimes you'll be able to query based on a parameter. Again, think of this as a function parameter. So I know that for the clicks, to get the clicks class, let's go back up here to the help here. So get clicks for a bitlink. You can see here that there are some query parameters, such as the unit. The default is day, but you could also specify minute, hour, week or month, the number of units. So the default is -1. You can specify things like size. So I want to use some of these parameters. The way that you specify that in your URI is you have your core URI, which is what I used before the clicks. Then you have the question mark, and then the name of the parameter value, in this case unit, because that's what it shows here, equals, and then the value. If you want to add multiple parameters, then you just concatenate with the ampersand sign and say units equals 3. So I want to find all of the links for this Bitly PowerShell Month of Lunches book over the last 3 months. So let's define that URI. So you should be able to see, there we go, so that all expanded right. Now, let's invoke REST method. So I got an object back, and so those are the the past 3 months, I've got those clicks, and so you can see there's the September, October, and November of this year. So November's been actually pretty amazing, 39 people, and it's only a couple weeks into the month. That's kind of impressive. I like that. Anyway, so I was able to query the REST API and pass parameters. Now, what if you want to post information? So let's expand a bitlink. So here's the URI, because I want to expand a link. And in this case, I want the content type to come back as JSON, so I'm going to add the content type to be JSON. Now, for this to work, I need to, well, let me go back here. Let's see, we are doing expand. Let's come back to the documentation. Expand a bitlink. So here, you can see the verb that I need to use is post. And again, there is the URI that I'm going to be using, and it needs to have the bitlink ID as part of the body. This is the key thing. It's not part of the header, it's part of the body. So the body has to be a string, but it also has to be a custom object. Well, the best way to do it is, here, I'll kind of do it in two steps. One, so there's a custom object that has the bitlink underscore ID, which is what this body is expecting, and then it needs a value. And so in my case, the value is my bitlylink. However, this needs to be converted to JSON because I'm going to pass a JSON object, and in order for that to work with Invoke REST method, that entire thing needs to be a string. So that's $body then will be basically a single string version of JSON that has the bit.ly ID. Hopefully you all follow that. So now I can invoke REST method using that URI, passing my headers, because that is my authentication and the content type. Here's the important parts. Now I need to specify that I'm using the post method and pass the body. And just to keep things useful, I'm just going to t the results to a variable $x. So there's the result that I get back, but I also saved it to $x so we can work with $x. So now I am able to expand that link. Let's say I just knew the link and go, what's that link pointing to? And now I can see that it's pointing to this long URL. All right? Hopefully everyone kind of followed that. That is kind of when I was building the module, those are some of the like proof of concept steps that I took just to make sure I understood the concept, the process, and I was interpreting the documentation appropriately. So now let's get into the actual module that I've been working with. And let's load up a bunch of files here. We don't need that. All right. So let's see where to begin here. So one thing that I did, again, this is not required. You can do however you want to do this, but I decided that because I'm getting objects back, well, I'm getting JSON back from the REST API, but I need to convert that into more PowerShell friendly stuff. So I created a class, a PowerShell class, that I could use to define a bitlylink object, or what I'm calling a PS bitlylink object. So when I get a bitlylink, S is going to instantiate an instance of this class, and I have a private function that I'm using that will create that object, and then I can write that object to the pipeline. I'm also doing a similar thing with the bitly user. And then because I've got some custom objects, I'm also, why not go ahead and define some custom default display properties and a display property set. So that's kind of helpful. So let's go here and look at the function here. So let's say that I want to do the get bitlylink. So the main part of the function here is I still have that same base URI that I had before. And I'm creating a hash table of parameters. And again, this is the same stuff that I was doing in my little proof of concept. I'm passing, though, what I require is the bitlylink and the, right, so that's the ID, it's the bitlylink. I also need to include the API key. So here's where it gets kind of tricky. One of the difficult things and one of the challenges in making something like this public is how do you store that API key? How do you pass it to the function that you are writing? Because I have to have the API key. I don't want to hard code it because then I can't share this with anyone. So for right now, I just have in all the functions that require it, I have a parameter called string API key. Now my solution, again, for right now, I may have to come up with something different in the long run. But right now in my PowerShell profile script, I pull my API key because I have it securely stored, and I have a PS default parameter value for all of the functions that have the bitlylink noun that have an API key. So I can run get bitlylink, and I don't have to specify the API key because it is passed as a default parameter value. So even though it's mandatory, I'm providing a value, so I'm covered there. Otherwise, if you were to use this module, for example, you would have to do something similar, or you'd have to always be entering in your API key. So I'm still struggling, to be honest with you, in finding a good way to store that. It may be that one thing that comes to mind is to prompt the user for the API key and store it in the registry. Although what I have now should work cross-platform, so that doesn't help me if I'm working this, if someone is running this and want to use it on Linux box. There is no registry. So I'm still kind of struggling long-term, and if the thing you are building does require API keys, that's something you're going to have to take into account. So let's get back to what I'm doing here. So you can see here that I'm creating a custom object. So I invoke REST method, and then I invoke my create PS bitlylink, which is in the private function, that's then going to create a custom object based on this class that's just taking the result. That's what $item is. Let me come back to the function. So $item, this thing here, is what I get back from running invoke REST method. Now, it should just be one thing, but in case someone is piping in a bunch of things, I wanted to be able to enumerate through. So that's how that will work. Let me go back to the demo here. The other thing that I have done, and I've done a similar thing here with other functions, but I've also created a custom formatting file. This is completely optional, by the way. I just know that because I'm creating potentially an object who has lots of properties, I may not necessarily want to see all those properties. I may just want to see a subset or something formatted. So this was created using my new PSXML file or command from the PS Script Tools module. And so with this loaded, I can create a object and have it formatted the way that I want it to be. And maybe I should just jump here and show this to you. Let me import the module, and we'll come back and look at some of the other commands. So those are the commands that are currently in the module. So let's get the bitlylink for the PS primer, the PowerShell Practice Primer. So that returns an object here, and let's run that again. All right, let's save this $B. So there is my custom object. There were all the properties, but $B just is using my default formatting. So now I can see everything that I want with that. Oh, very nice. I didn't have to do anything. This is really now easy for me to use. I just need to be able to get the objects. In fact, once I get those objects, I can then pass them. There's another method for bitlylink summary. Let's come in here and look at that function. So this requires a bitlylink summary, and again, you can specify the units of time and how many objects you want. Here's my header for my authorization key. And I'm going to specify the number of clicks and building the URI from the parameter values of the parameters I want to pass from the function basically to the REST API. And then I just create a custom object with the result. Now in this case, the method is get, so that's all good. And I've written this, by the way, in such a way so that the bitlylink for get summary here can take value from pipeline by property name by ID. You'll notice that this object here has an ID because I knew in looking at the documentation that there would be a situation where I'd want to get one thing and pipe it to something else by reusing that bitlylink. So I made sure that my property names would line up for parameter binding. Because once I do that, then I can easily run a command like this. So get that bitlylink for my PS primer, and then find me all of the links, all the clicks in the last 3 months, and we'll just save that to variable $P. So over the last 3 months, there have been 426 clicks on the bitlylink. Now at that point to the PowerShell practice primer. And then I have $P if I wanted to reuse it. So it's really kind of a helpful approach that I am taking here, I think, is that going through and parsing out the documentation and finding how can I convert something that is in the documentation into a PowerShell command. Let's look at the set at the creating a new bitlylink. So there is create a bitlylink. So here's the documentation. So again, here this is going to be post. It's going to be the verb, and this is going to require the bitlinks. The body schema needs to be the domain, the title, the group GUID, which you can get from your user account, any sort of tags that you want to specify, and the long URL, which is required. So knowing these parameters, and I can see the method is post, and I know this, let's see how I turn that into a function. So let's find, this is where using VS Code comes in handy here, but all right, so set bitlylink. Now this is going to write an object of the pipeline. It's going to be my PS bitlylink object. I need to specify the link. I have an optional value for title, an array of tags. There is a parameter here for a switch for archive, which I think is still a work in progress. I'm not quite sure why I have that there. That is something I'm still trying to figure out if that works still. And then, of course, my API key. So I pass it a new, I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong function. That's the set. I want to create a new one. Sorry. Yeah. Oh, here we go. At the beginning. New bitlylink. All right, let's try this. All right, so now I need the long URL to shorten, the URL, and the API key. So what I have found is in creating a new bitlylink, the title stuff is better to do in the set API, which is why I have the second one. So I'm going to create a new API key or a new bitlylink here. Let's see how this works. So again, here is my headers. So I want this to be, I'm going to post JSON file, JSON content, and there's my authorization. There's the URI, which I pulled from the documentation. My Invoke REST method parameters. So right now the body is null in my begin block because I could be piping in a bunch of links. And I'm now going to create that link and take the URL for the body, convert that then to a JSON, and then make sure that the body parameter is converted to a string. Actually, that's just for the verbose output. And then I can do invoke REST method. Now, invoke REST method doesn't have a -what if, so I've included my own -what if support here. And then this will create a bit.ly link. So let's see if this will work here. So help new. I don't have full help yet written. No. I forgot what I called my command. Oh, new bit.ly link, that's why. And let's do, let me think of, I'll create one for Pluralsight. Here, let's go. All right, so there's the what if. So it did not create anything, but you can see, and I have the verbose, so it kind of shows me what it's going to be doing here. So let's go ahead and create this link. So you can see the REST, invoke REST method will give you verbose output. That's where all this is, the performing. My verbose output always has, I put in like a little header like begin process. This private, this is in the class itself. I have found it helpful sometimes, even though classes don't have any sort of parameter binding or anything like that, if you sneak in a verbose message like this and you detect, if the class detects, hey, I'm in a verbose state, then it will light up that verbose output. So then I can troubleshoot if I need to and see, okay, where am I in my development process, what's being created, what's going on, and I have found that to be quite helpful. So you can see there in the process, now I'm in private and then ending. So I created $P. Now, let's say that I want to give $P a new title and maybe add a tag to that. So the set bit.ly link, and that's the code I started showing you before. I realized I was in the wrong function. So the set bit.ly link has these parameters of title, tags. The archive is what I'm still trying to sort out. And the method here is patch. And this is something that threw me at first until I looked at this. So if you want to update. So the verb is not post, it's patch. And so that could be something you may not be used to, but again, there's the link, and then you can see all of the parameters, and that's what I'm building here into the function. So I've got code that if I pass certain parameters, such as title or tags, I just add them to the URI that I'm going to be building, and then create the bitlylink. So let's do $P. Site. Oh, let's go back. Let's try this with dash for both so you can see. The tags also have to be sent as JSON following the same process. And now let's do this for real. And there's the link if I wanted to. I could do get bitlylink. And now there is the updated link. And if I wanted to, I could go up to the website. If I wanted to add a custom link, then I could go through and do that. I have an entry here for custom links. You cannot create custom links with the free Bitly account, which is what I have, which is all I really need. So if I want to create custom Bitly links, I just have to go online into a browser, manually edit the link. But I can still get the custom links. I'll see that when I retrieve the link object, but I don't have the right account to do everything that the API is available to you. And that's something else that you might need to take into account. So this project is up on GitHub. It's still, I just switched it over from private to public just a couple hours ago. It's still very much in process. I have a lot more work to do before it comes even close to showing up on the PowerShell gallery, but I'd like to think it's a good example of how you can take a REST-based API and turn it into a set of PowerShell commands. So all I've, in essence, done is taken the commands that I found in the documentation, and it helps that this is good documentation, and then turn them into appropriate PowerShell commands. All right, so let's see what else I have here. So that's kind of the project I'm working on that I wanted to show you. The last little thing to talk about, which we kind of already have, is how to handle that API key. That's probably the biggest thing. Again, stored in the registry. You could save it as a CMS message, and that is a possibility because I'm not quite sure the CMS messages are working cross-platform yet. Right now, for me personally, the PS default parameter values works just fine. I just know long-term I'm going to have to come up with a much better solution. If anyone has some ideas, I'd love to hear that. So that's probably the biggest thing. Again, I don't worry too much about the throttle limits or the API limits because I'm not making tens of thousands. And if other people were to use this module, they all have their own API keys. So that's not that big a deal. So it shouldn't be a problem. I do have another resource here if you are interested in this sort of thing, if you want to look at another project, and that is the PS Release Tools module. You can install it from the PowerShell gallery. It's also up there on my GitHub repo. Here's the link for the Bitly project that I just showed you. The PS Release Tools uses the GitHub API, which is free to use. You don't have to log in or anything. But there are still some API limits, so if you, and I think it detects it more by your IP address as where it's coming from. I've had no one say, hey, I run into these problems because I'm using your tool, and maybe lots of people are. I don't think that is an issue. But if you want to see another example of how to create a PowerShell module around the idea of consuming some REST-based APIs, this would be a good thing to look at. The GitHub APIs are also nicely documented. So that is kind of what I had to talk about. Someone's got to have questions. What was confusing? What did I go too quickly through?
I think Jason had a question. He says, what was the reason behind creating a header per function? Is that, best practice?
Well, if he's talking about
Like your authentication per function.
right, so I'm only doing this once in the begin block. So in the begin block, for example, here in the set bitlylink, I have to include my API key. So I have to include the authorization header. But I only have to do that once in the begin block because that then becomes part of the hash table of parameters that I'll end up splatting to invoke REST method down in the process block. So
Yeah, I thought you had this same kind of begin block in the other functions. Is that?
and I might, right, yeah. So in the, like here, new bitlylink, same type of thing. I have to have my header.
Yeah.
I suppose you could make that a variable that is part of your module. I think I'd much rather have it as part of the begin block, as part of the code itself. That way everything is completely self-contained. So if I wanted to copy and paste this outside of my module and do some other testing or something with it, I have everything together.
Oh, yeah.
What else? Does any of this look useful to anyone? Maybe not the Bitly part, but.
So Jeff, one other challenge I've had writing modules for REST APIs is, and I feel like I'm missing like some key bit of knowledge, is that a lot of these APIs don't give me very good descriptions when they fail. For example, I'll have some where I got to authenticate and then I get a token back, and I can use that token for a period of time, but when that time expires, I just start getting 404s or whatever, or error 500s. I don't get anything that says, hey, you need to log in again, or
that's where you're limited by the documentation, and you have to remember a lot of these REST APIs are written obviously by developers, and they're expecting a developer audience is most likely going to consume them. I'm expecting a lot of people watching and listening to this, we're IT pros. I'm not a developer. So when you get an error, it's a lousy experience. You go, well, what's going on? There is no easy answer because so much of it just depends upon the service you're consuming and how well it's written and what data you can get back. I believe in the Bitly case, let me go back to the documentation here. So they have actually, so if you get different types of errors like 400, you'll see you can get some data back. Or if you were to get like a 500 error, so you have some idea, but not every service is written nicely. Sometimes I think some of these REST APIs are just done after the fact. The boss says, "Oh, hey, by the way, we need a REST API because someone just knocked it out over lunch," and they just throw something together, and it meets. It's just a box for them to check up. Say, "Oh yeah, we gave you a REST API." But hopefully you can find, if you need to consume something or work with something, that it is well documented.
Yeah.
Or turn to some of the developer tools like AutoRest or the SOAP UI or Swagger type tools to help you try to programmatically uncover what the REST API is doing and what it is expecting.
Yeah. I thought I didn't know about those tools until your session here today, and I knew that Azure was auto-generating them somehow. So AutoRest, that's something that would have to be fed from the developer side, right? Not us. Like,
Right.
can we run auto rest against some API?
I don't know. I took a glance at that and realized, yeah, that makes my head hurt.
Yeah.
I don't have enough bourbon in the house to get through that. Yeah, I think a lot of that auto rest stuff, at least from what I looked at, is really aimed more at a developer audience. I'm an old school kind of guy. I just want to, create something that I know is going to work, and I understand what I'm doing, and it meets a specific need that I am defining. So in my case, I wanted something to help me get a handle on creating bitly-links without having to always go to the website. So that's kind of where this all started, and I discovered, oh, there's an API. Oh, it's REST method. There's a REST API. I know how to use Invoke REST method. I've done some other stuff like that, like the who is with the error.net. I've been doing this for a bit. I bet I can do this. I did the whole PS release tool using the GitHub API. So it wasn't that foreign to me, and then I found the documentation. Oh, this is perfect. Now, one thing, again, documentation is important. You have to check, for example, in the bitlylink, they've got version 3 of the API, which is basically deprecated. That's going away. So all the new stuff I'm doing is on v4. Potentially, if I were to, finish this bitly module, for all I know, that, this time next year, Bitly will say, oh yeah, v4 is deprecated, now we've got v5, and now all of a sudden my stuff doesn't work. So you kind of have to be prepared that you may have to go back and update things. That's why you want to make sure when you're building your code, and that should go through this as well, make sure you add some good documentation about what it is that you are doing and how this all works.
Yeah. Jeff, do you have any in your repo? Do you possibly have any examples of dealing with paginated results?
Well, yeah, actually, I don't know if I'm paginating in with PS release tools or not. I know that in this case, like the get bitly link, there's a get bitly link by group ID that has a size. Well, I gave it a size property because if you look at the groups, or 3 bit links by group. So this has a, so here's an example where you can specify the page, but you could also specify, I don't know if this is the one I'm using. So this, let's come back here if I can figure this out. So this is using groups. Yeah, and then there's a size, which is basically the number of values number of links that you want to get back, and the default is, in the documentation, the default is 50, which is what I set here, and I just arbitrarily said, you know what, I'm just going to limit that any number between 1 and 1,000. So it's not necessarily paging, but you can, depending upon the API call you're making, you may be able to specify the number of entries or number of results that you can return.
Okay.
So that might help. Otherwise, yeah, you look through the PS release tools code. I can't recall off the top of my head if I'm doing anything there with paging. I don't think so, because I don't think there's that much stuff that comes back from GitHub for the PowerShell the PowerShell GitHub repo that requires paging.
Okay. Gotcha.
I think I've done something else with where paging came into play, but it escapes me. If I can find it, I will blog about it. I'll do that. If not, if I don't have anything, then maybe I'll just still need to blog about it anyway. So I'll find something. Because that's a good question. And again, I will, provide a link to the group so you guys can download my demo file. Although really most everything that you're going to want to see is up on my GitHub repo. So GitHub JDHIT Solutions. Be everything that you need. Anything else? Yeah.
Earlier, when you were taking your custom object and then piping it to convert to JSON and then piping it to outstring, was that basically to take your multi-line JSON and make it a single line JSON?
Yeah. I think convert to JSON. I think it has another parameter that will minify it, so I probably don't have to do that. But when I was writing that code, I thought, oh, that's just as easy just to make it a string. But yeah, that's basically it, to make sure that it's treated that could pass as a string.
Okay. I guess the custom object could have just been a list then.
It just needs to look like JSON.
Yeah, a key pair. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the thing. So another thing that you'll find when you look at documentation for a lot of these REST APIs is a lot of them use curl, and you just basically can substitute invoke REST method and tweak a few parameters, and you're almost home. So curl is the Linux equivalent of invoke REST method of invoking a web command or sending something to a website.
Jeff, I guess the only other question I would have is how do you clean up at the end, or how do you, you ran this once and it populated a variable. Well, I guess you populated your variable before running any of these functions with your key.
Yeah, the key, my API key is in my profile, and I added a PS default parameter value so that all of my bitly functions that require an API key is set as the default value. So I never have to specify it.
Yeah, and this is a little simpler because you just have a key. You're not having to exchange the key for a token that you have to refresh.
Correct. For in the bitly case, once I created my token, so far I've been able to continue to reuse it.
Yeah. Okay.
GitHub has some stuff that you can do, for example, such as creating a repo or getting information from a repo. If you want to get your own stuff, then you need to authenticate, and you need a token. And I believe that token also can be persistent until you revoke it. But yeah, any other type of authorization, like I don't know if Twitter has any sort of API that you can consume. It used to, but they've changed it years ago. If you have to generate authenticate uniquely every time, that is definitely another challenge. But it's not something I have run across yet, at least in the sites that I've been working with.
Well, I have one service that I've worked with called Mass 360. I don't work with it anymore with my current job, but with my last gig I did, and it was kind of a pain because they had a throttle limit not just on usage of the API for general requests, but they had a much smaller throttle limit on authentication requests. And so the strategy was you would first authenticate with a username and an API key, and then in exchange for that, you would get a token back. That then all subsequent requests should have that token in your new header. Yeah, and so I thought, okay, well I'll create like how VMware does, have like a connect dash or a login dash, 360, blah blah blah.
Yeah.
And that's great and all, except that token would expire after an hour. That's one problem. And so I'd have to know to refresh it, even though the error I got was just a general error when it did expire. And then two, if I set it to a variable, there's the cleanup bit, right? So like if I hadn't run this in a while, but I've set it as a variable in my session, say 2 days later I go try to reuse that session, I had no way, I could try to detect, is the variable already there? And then if so, use it. And then if it's a bad token, then, use it and get an error. And I couldn't come with a graceful approach to this.
Yeah, that's
As far as the limits on the API, because I was getting GeoIP information to make sure messages sent through Office 365 originated in the U.S. And the service I was using, if you had more than 150 requests a minute, you would get banned. So what I did, I wrote my function and I put start sleep in it, and I made sure that you could never exceed 150 a minute. But in addition to that, every time I would get an IP back that was based in the U.S., I would actually store that in a database. And what I would do is grab all the ones out of the database first. So I was building my own database from their database. So I would check my database first, and then I would query theirs. And if it was a non-US IP, then I would send like an alert.
Yeah, so you're basically building your own caching system, which is a smart thing for that type of thing. I was finding that when I was creating bitlylinks, if I wanted to include a title, I found that I couldn't really do it with, even though the documentation says I should be able to create a link and include things like titles and tags, I found that I had to do a two-step process. One, create the plain bit.ly link, and then take that link and then set title tags and up little updates to it. So I wrote my functions, new bit.ly link pipe to set bit.ly link. But what I was running into was that the set bit.ly link, that code was running before the website had a chance to finish processing my new request. So now if I do that, I have to make sure I put in a little sleep so that create the link, wait a few seconds, and then pipe it to set, so that I give the service a chance to commit the new link to its database or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So you just have to think about, as with any PowerShell tool, who's going to be using it and what are their expectations, and then write your code accordingly. And that's where having objects and being able to line stuff up with pipeline and parameter binding all makes your life a whole lot easier, at least when it comes to using the commands. And so that's the other thing that I have done. That's one of the reasons I created the class object, to kind of standardize about what my thing is going to look like. That made it then easier for me to pipe parameters or pipe objects between commands by parameter binding, by property name between the different parameters. Which is something you should think about regardless of whether you're doing anything with REST APIs. That's just, smart PowerShell scripting. Anything else?
Once? Going twice?
Thanks, Jeff. It was awesome.
Thank you very much for having me.
Oh, thank you very much for presenting for us.